This talk is venturing into unmapped arias. It's more or less about how to find your way towards accessible component patterns when you're asked to build something that doesn't fit into conventional, well-mapped patterns and kind of out-of-the-box components. And the reason I wanted to give this, and I've been thinking a lot about this, is I imagine many of you, I am increasingly asked to build things that the web wasn't really designed for, whether that's complex components, very app-like experiences, things that often there are no good guides on how to do. And the reason that I personally think about this a lot is I work as a software developer on the Fluent component system at Microsoft, which is a JavaScript library of web components built on React. And I also contribute to the ARIA spec and ARIA practices guide, which is all to say I spend a lot of time researching existing patterns and working on defining new ones. And I also work with a lot of people who take the stuff I write and build and create very unexpected things with it. And so this question of how to kind of communicate, how to extend patterns and how to like accessibly and safely build new things is something that's on my mind a lot. So if we're going to talk about kind of going off of the map, it's probably useful to define what the map looks like and what it's made up of. So on the slide, I have some screenshots of the ARIA specification, the A11Y project resources page, and the Inclusive Components website, all of which are great examples of where you might go to find kind of definitions for how to build things and guidance on how to build things. A slightly more in-depth look at what composes our map, so to speak, includes specifications. Probably could guess that specifications like the ARIA spec, the Accessible Rich Internet Applications spec, which is a set of attributes, roles, and kind of additions to the HTML language that you can put on and kind of manually define semantics. The ARIA practices guide, which is not a spec, but is also put out by the W3C and is a little more approachable maybe than the ARIA spec and has kind of recipes for how to implement it. And lesser known specs that deserve more love, like ARIA and HTML, which has guidance on what ARIA is valid on certain HTML elements, and HTML and core AAM, which are definitions for how ARIA and HTML map to system, like platform accessibility mappings. All of these are very, very useful because they're pretty much definitive, but often harder to read and understand than blog posts and articles, which is to say that if you are kind of just wading into the maybe ties between semantics and interaction, it's going to be hard to read the ARIA spec and understand how to implement it. But when you're building something, the ARIA spec is a complete kind of definition of everything you can use in ARIA. So that's where specs live. Another resource are blogs and articles, websites like Inclusive Components and the A11Y project I mentioned before, also 24 Accessibility, which is an article series, lots and lots of blogs and articles that I can't mention here. There's a lot of great resources and a lot of people writing good stuff. When you consume these, it's really good to evaluate kind of the trustworthiness of the source, how authoritative it is, and also look at the date of anything written and compare across multiple places. This is because the more technical and in-depth articles tend to be, the more quickly they can get out of date. So looking at date, who's writing them, where's it coming from, and comparing across multiple places is really important here. And finally, like even less trustworthy maybe than blogs and articles are framework accessibility docs. I'm saying this despite working on them myself. And this is because frameworks that have documentation about accessibility are a good resource of people who have worked on building components and thought about accessibility in the past. So it's sometimes useful to refer to how somebody else has done things. If you're maybe building your own combo box, it's nice to see like, how did this person in this library build it in the past? But it's really, really important to take these with a grain of salt because frameworks come with histories and baggage, and the solutions that they decided might not make sense for you, depending on your context and what you're working with. And so like keeping in mind like context of the sources you're looking at versus the context of what you're building in is so important, especially here. And that's going to be something I keep saying in this talk, that paying attention to context is really important, because it's when you're going off on your own, that's the most important thing to look at when you're evaluating your sources. And as I mentioned before, once you've looked at kind of all these different possible sources of information, kind of the various different maps that are laid out, it's really important to compare them because they might not say the same thing. For example, on screen, I have a screenshot of the ARIA practices guide example for a navigation menu bar. It is demonstrating using menu rules to build a fairly straightforward set of navigation links. And next to it, there is a screenshot of an article from Adrian Roselli called "Don't Use ARIA Menu Rules for Site Nav." So on the surface, these say exactly the opposite. So if you only looked at the ARIA practices guide and said, yes, I should use menu rules for navigation, you would miss kind of this overwhelming consensus of other accessibility professionals who say essentially don't do that. And the thing is, the ARIA practices guide is not entirely wrong here, because there are cases, there are contexts in which you want to use menu rules for navigation related things. Like, for example, say you're building like literally Google Docs or Photoshop or Word Online or something like that. Navigation in those contexts, and very like app-like context, might make sense to be menus and menu rules or even tree rules. And there's nothing wrong with that decision. And that's part of the reason this is on the APG, and also why there's a cautionary bubble there, because context matters so much. And evaluating context is going to be what gets you from a source to an understanding of how to build your own stuff. So I've been talking about, this is kind of like what the map is composed of. So let's look at what it actually covers. What are patterns that are examples of things that are well mapped and well defined? And I want to say here that well defined is not the same as easy. Patterns, a lot of patterns like combo boxes and trees and things like that are very complex and hard to do well and have a lot of nuance and gotchas and things like that. But when I say well-defined, I mean there's a lot of guidance out there on how to do them. So for example, combo boxes that I mentioned, I have some examples pictured of the ARIA practices guide again, which has 6 separate examples of different combo boxes, and also a blog post that I actually wrote that dives really deep on how to build accessible combo boxes, how they map to accessibility APIs, things like that. So very, very complex, a lot of stuff to learn, but a lot of material too. Tables as well, complex things that have 2-dimensional data and semantics that need to communicate that 2-dimensional data. But for example, I have a couple blog posts, search results from Adrian Roselli again, because he's very prolific, that has just like lists and lists of different articles if you search table on his site. So lots and lots and lots of information on how to build tables, even though they are a very complex pattern. And form errors is another example that isn't strictly a component, but it is a UI pattern that also has lots of material on how to do them well. And slight shout out here to my friend Shell Little, who will be talking about form error patterns and cognitive accessibility tomorrow in her talk, as another great example of the wealth of information out there about how to build form errors, which is a pattern that has a lot of nuance and complexity to it as well. So if those are well defined, let's start to venture out a little here into what it means to build something that is kind of maybe a little bit beyond the map. Things where, you know, the guidance starts to get sketchy and a little hard to find. And I have pictured a combo box or something that looks like a combo box, but there is a search input inside the dropdown rather than as the trigger. So it looks on the surface like something that's very familiar, but then you look at it a little harder and it's maybe a little bit of a hybrid thing, a little weird. Some other examples are, say you're building a grid, but it has edit capability and also selection, but the selection is for entire rows, things like that, where it feels like it should fit into a grid pattern, but you dive into it a little bit and it gets a little more complex. The combo box I mentioned is where each tree item has a couple extra actions on it, things like this, where there's guidance you can find, but it doesn't cover the specifics of what you're building. So let's actually look into what you would need to do to start to build something like this. If you're planning your expedition out into these uncharted waters, some things to do are first kind of gather your existing maps, gather the guidance you can find, look for everything from like specs, articles, everything I mentioned that you can find, and bring it all together in one place. And then because we're talking about patterns that are kind of a little bit past the map, it can be useful to look for prior examples from further afield. For example, native desktop and native mobile patterns. And this is because users interact with their desktops and their phones all the time. So they will have like prior intuition built up from patterns on native platforms. And it can be useful to see how those, like if there are any of those that might relate to what you're doing, especially because a lot of these patterns, these more complex patterns, come from more app-like experiences, and there's a lot more complex apps on native desktop and native mobile. Once you've kind of gathered all these sources, again, it's so important to look at context, like interpret context, look at the why behind why each different thing was designed, because even though I just told you to look at desktop patterns, for example, the context behind why decisions were made might differ for a desktop app versus a web app. And finally, once you've done all of that, have all of your prior research, I find it really useful to make a very specific list of what is missing, what decisions I need to make that I still don't know how to make. So to kind of, it's all very theoretical, to kind of make it a little more real, let's imagine we're building an application, and within that application, there's a UI that users need to frequently do where they select files, similar to File Explorer on Windows or Finder on Mac, or any like file open type experience. And you're building this in your very application-like web application, not a website. So this is our context. This is the stuff I know going in of what we're building. So step one, let's look at the maps. There's a lot of very in-depth specific information on the ARIA spec, for example, about table and grid semantics, the allowed attributes on grid cells, how to build checkboxes, everything that might be similar to what I'm doing. There are blog posts, again, I put Adrian's blog up there again, but there's a ton of other resources as well. I've written stuff, other people have written stuff about how to build grids and tables. Also information about interaction, arrow keys move between grid cells, for example, in a grid pattern on the web, examples, stuff like that. So let's look a little further afield now, because there are some subtleties that are different in this kind of File Explorer type example versus a standard web grid, which is, for example, that you're selecting an entire row, not just like checking one cell. And it's a very like specific type of grid that doesn't fit into other types of grids, like maybe spreadsheets or straight up tabular data. Some examples that I would look at are definitely File Explorer and Finder. I keep mentioning them because they are also file selection experiences, and even stuff like on Microsoft Word or Photoshop. When you go to open recent files, there is a UI where you arrow through files, also very similar. So those are all desktop experiences, native desktop experiences that are similar to this. And once you've done this, the important thing is to go back through and evaluate them and look at context, as I mentioned before. And I talked about the value of looking at desktop, but it is so important to remember while you're doing that the web is not desktop and desktop is not the web. There are into web applications and stuff in the browser with different expectations for things like how virtual cursor works in a screen reader, or how the tab key works with the keyboard, or how like reader view exists on the web. And those are different from native apps. And also like native desktop and mobile apps are built for one platform. So they can very specifically use the accessibility APIs for that platform, whereas web apps need to work across all platforms that web is available on. And that means you need to define things in a way that will work across all different accessibility APIs. And also beyond semantics, things like color modes, speech control, stuff like that, that will differ across platforms. And native apps only have to deal with the one. And also as a quick aside, if you're building a hybrid native app like an Electron, this gets more complex because the users may come in with expectations set up by native desktop apps or native mobile apps, but you're still working with the tools given you by web. Not going to talk about that in more depth, just that is, if you're building something like that, that is another layer of context to consider. As a kind of more specific example of how desktop is not the web, if you dive into File Explorer and how the semantics work, File Explorer on Windows is a list. It is not a table, it is a list, but it has columns. And those columns are semantically exposed to screen reader users. I have a screenshot on screen of the grid view of File Explorer. I'm talking specifically about the view where you do have columns. And I show looking at this with accessibility insights for Windows, and it's showing a single file that is selected and highlighted that is a list item. And it has a list item semantics, but there are also cells within it that have table cell, like a table pattern applied. And this is possible on Windows because of how the Windows accessibility APIs work. It is also interestingly possible on Mac. Now I'm showing Finder. I'm using the accessibility inspector on Mac OS to look at the accessibility API information there. It is also a list view, like the column view of Finder is also a list view where you still have individual column information for cells within it. And this kind of composability, this more like Lego brick approach to accessibility semantics is much more common, or is the case on Windows and Mac OS in a way that it is not on web. You cannot make a hybrid list table on web because the language just does not support it. So it's when evaluating different examples like this across platforms, it is so important to remember that like you are building with a different language and you might have different options. And the specific UI they came up with on desktop is informed by what they're working with, which is not always the same. So now let's weigh our sources. We've looked at kind of native examples, which despite being different are still valuable, web examples for grid. There are, coming in, looking at all of this, I might think something like, well, the native examples inform me that this kind of linear navigation through rows is more expected with file selection, but there is still like column information. I want to weigh how important that column information is. Navigating back and forth by cells is a web pattern, but isn't quite as like one-to-one mapped to the file selection pattern I'm trying to build. I'm not giving you a straight answer on which is better. I'm just saying that's context that I'm considering. Checkboxes within cells or selectable cells is something that you can find information on in specs and examples. Looking at all of that and weighing all of that. So now that the resources are collected, what I would do here and what I have done here, because this is actually a pretty real example, is write down the things that I still don't know. In this case, some of those are, for example, as specific as where does the focus target go when you are arrowing through the grid? Is it going on the row as a whole, which is what native desktop does, but has worse support on the web because web grid rows were not built to get focus. There's some naming issues. There's issues with exposing selection on the row element, but it gives you kind of a linear navigation. So does focus go on the row? Does it go on the cell that the checkbox is in? The first cell that shows an actual check, is the focus on the cell itself or on the checkbox within it? And there's a really important distinction here where if you send the focus to the checkbox, Windows screen readers with multiple modes will be switched into the incorrect mode. and you won't, it'll screw up arrow keying, using the arrow keys to move through the grid. But if you put focus on the cell, grids are not fundamentally a selection widget. They do support selection, but the support for that, the practical support for that is a little worse. So changes in ARIA selected, if you put focus on the cell, might not be exposed as well, might not work as well in virtual cursor, things like that. So that is an open question that does not have an easy answer, and you will not find a lot of guidance out there telling you what to do here. Another question is, what name do you give the checkbox? That feels like it should be straightforward because it's a file selection. The name of the checkbox should be the name of the file. But if you're building this as a grid or a table, you might also want to make the file name column the row header, because that makes sense. As you're moving through, every piece of data is related to the file name. So if you name the checkbox the file name and also have the file name as the row header, you get a fair amount of verbosity there, which may or may not be useful. Also, not a lot of guidance on how to do this well. And then there is the column header for the checkboxes. If it's not on screen right now, but the design was to have a select all checkbox in the column header. But if you name that checkbox select all, then suddenly the column header name for every single checkbox is now select all. So you navigate over to a checkbox for an individual file and you hear the column header select all, which is not relevant to you once you're kind of in individual files. So lots of open questions. And this is, I know, very detailed. I'm not trying to tell you how to build a grid right now. I'm just giving this stuff as examples of the sort of detail I go into when I'm trying to figure out, like, what do I still not know? And at this point, I think it's really useful to circle back to the original design, because if you're here, you've done a bunch of research, you've thought a lot about in-depth questions. Now it's good to ask, were my initial assumptions correct? Are there other ways to interpret the design? Should I talk to designers maybe about the design itself? For example, something to consider here is whether this should be a grid or should it be a list box? Because a list box on web is natively a selection widget that has linear navigation through it. The drawback there is that a list box will not expose column information. So a good thing to ask your designer and to think about, if you're a developer like me, is whether the columns, like, how important is the column information? Is there only one other column? Are there a couple other columns? Do those need to be columns? Could they be like, could the file size and type be a description for the file name, which is the name of the item, versus like separate columns? Something to look at is on small screens, does that information go away? Does it collapse underneath the name? That might tell you, for example, from a design side, how important that information is, whether it should be columns. You know, just question your assumptions, talk to design, ask them what they think, how they would weigh the importance of like this linear navigation versus column-based like structure. And yeah, just talk about that, open a conversation. No one answer really here. And then finally, I mentioned talking to your designer, but it's also really, really important to talk to and get feedback from people who will actually have to use this. And because we're talking about accessibility, specifically people with disabilities who will have to use this. And this is extra important if you don't have a disability that is going to be primarily impacted by the choices you're making. So in my case, I was very lucky to be able to do a usability study. So I made a bunch of prototypes of these different options and ran a study. If you can't do that, if you don't have the resources to do that, I would still suggest making different prototypes and then ask on Twitter, ask on the accessibility Slack, try to get feedback from coworkers maybe whose job is also invested in this design, not just bothering disabled people who work with you, who work on other things, because that's not cool. But yes, get feedback from wherever you can, make the prototypes, see what you can find out. When I went into this usability study, I had some assumptions going in, some hypotheses. I did think that navigating by cell, moving focus on cells rather than rows, would work better just based on my knowledge of support on the web. I thought putting focus on the cell, but still including a checkbox inside the cell would work better because of how Windows screen reader modes work. And I thought that selection should not follow focus. So if you go to File Explorer and you arrow through, selection follows your arrow keys. I thought that was bad, just because I'd done some stuff on combo boxes in the past. So I had these hypotheses, and I did some studies. I actually did 2 different studies about a year apart. The second study, I incorporated some of the learnings from the first, and I looked at a lot of things besides selection, but within the area of selection, I looked at row selection versus cell selection, how to deal with checkbox naming, stuff like that. And there's a lot of text on this slide where I list the people who participated in this study and what assistive tech they used, but the TLDR is common screen readers on Windows and Mac OS, also refreshable Braille, switch mobility devices like Switch and Dragon Naturally Speaking, magnification software. All of those were assistive tech that was used by participants. And some of the takeaways, this makes me sound good because my assumptions were correct, which was navigating by cell and not by row worked much better. Putting focus on the cell, but including a checkbox also worked pretty well. Putting focus on the checkbox wasn't terrible either, but yeah. And selection not following focus was a correct assumption. But the fun thing about actually checking things with people is you find out all of these things that you didn't think about that you should have. And some of the things I learned from this usability study was, for example, validation and confirmation messages for user interactions are extremely necessary. So if somebody like inputs text or does a selection, selects a row or multiple rows, they need to be able to review what they've done. And especially when you're building something complex, that is so, so important. The ability to review easily and have confirmation that something happened. And details matter. There were some buttons that I should have spent more time thinking about the name for. And as a developer, I often think like button has a name, it's relevant, it says what it does, check mark. When really I should have thought a lot more about the nuances of the language I used, because like details again matter. And if you're building something complex, every single simple detail needs to be nailed down so you don't add to the cognitive load of the already difficult thing you're asking people to do. Another couple screen reader specific things are needing to switch screen reader modes back and forth manually was really annoying and that annoyance built up over time, especially with something like a table. Bugs with virtual cursor navigation with tables, that's like using the screen reader cursor to move through like rows and columns. Like bugs with that will make somebody abandon the task very easily. And something I hadn't been thinking about is needing to scroll a lot to find information within a table, especially in 2 dimensions, was a lot to ask of somebody using a mobility assistance device in general. So lots of blind spots there, and that's why getting the feedback was so important. And why I really like when you're building complex stuff, when you're building off the map stuff, I think one of the main takeaways was like details matter so much. There is a death by 1,000 cuts thing here where because we're building something complex, we're thinking about big high level questions, and those obviously matter and need to be nailed down. But the details can't be forgotten because they will like build up, and the difference between a very clear button name and a kind of throwaway button name will make a lot of difference when somebody's trying to figure out your weird combo box. And the weirder the thing you're building, the more important this is. Another kind of high-level question that I find myself asking a lot and thinking about a lot is the balance between efficiency and discoverability. Ideally, these don't clash. Ideally, you should make something that's very easy to use, easy to learn, and also has a lot of efficiency, like extra keyboard shortcuts, extra whatever layered on top. But sometimes they do. Like if you're making a decision between a table and a grid, fundamentally a table is probably easier and has a shallower learning curve, and a grid has a steeper learning curve. And a grid is just fundamentally more efficient for a keyboard user. So you might have to make that type of decision. and then asking yourself the context of the users, of the people using your app, and the context of the thing you're building is really important. Like, are you building a application like Google Sheets? Like, are you building a spreadsheet? Are you building for something for somebody who's spending 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, probably not 8, 5 hours a day, 5 days a week, using? Because then efficiency is going to be really, really important, and they're going to be willing to learn a UI. Or are they using it for like a couple hours once every other month? In which case someone probably isn't willing to learn some like proprietary, like custom way of doing things, and something simpler would be better. And also, how tech savvy are the users? Is your user base, I don't know, accountants who spend all their waking hours in a spreadsheet, or is it something more generic that lots of people use? And when I think about this, something I have to keep reminding myself, especially as a developer, is a shallow learning curve is almost always more important than you think. And even if you think your users are very tech savvy, they probably also want a shallow learning curve. So I know we're kind of running low on time, so I'm going to try to go through this pretty quickly. But I talked about going slightly off the map. Now let's go way off the map to the cursed ARIAs. And when you're doing this, I'm not going to talk about design decisions much because I'm a developer, but it is really important when you're doing something like this to ask yourself, is this off the map because it needs to be, or is this off the map because of decisions that could be reconsidered to kind of simplify to more well-known patterns? Because well-known patterns are almost always better. But let's look at a legitimately off-the-map example. This is a flowchart. This particular flowchart goes through whether you should decide to take on a new project. You should ask yourself, do you have enough time for this? If no, don't do it. If yes, no, you're wrong. You don't have time for it. Don't do it. So while I'm shaming myself, the actual point is just look at a simple flowchart. This doesn't really map into any existing patterns. It's not a list box. It's not a grid. It's maybe a tree, but maybe not. So if you're building something like this, that's just doesn't have precedent. What I usually do is start small, like ask yourself, what are the fundamental interactions of a single node on the flowchart? Does it have one click? Is it like a button where you can do one thing and activate it and it does a single thing? Or does it have multiple other actions? Can you maybe drag and move it and change kind of where it is and how it connects? Or can you do nothing? Is it just informational? So start with like the smallest, most specific interactions, define those well, and then zoom out a little and look at navigation. How do you get from point A to point B? So if you have a flowchart like I have on screen with A, B, and C nodes that all connect and some other nodes that branch off, how do you get from A to C with the keyboard specifically? Because often stuff like this is designed visually and for mouse users, and focusing on keyboard navigation and getting through it will help you kind of think about how this really works, and in a way that will then inform questions about other things like speech control and touch. And so after you've done that, after you've thought about keyboard on its own, just looking at your UI, sometimes it's good to step back and look at whether it is similar to any existing patterns like tree grid, or list box, maybe in the case of flowcharts. But do this afterwards, because otherwise you might fall into the trap of trying to force keyboard navigation into an existing box that it doesn't necessarily fit. And then also zoom out even more about the specifics of how you navigate the pixels on the screen and ask, are there any other features that I can add to make this easier? Like, for example, a search or a filter capability that would let you jump to a specific node without needing to like dive into all of the nodes in the flowchart. Because like the more complex the thing you're building, the ability to just like get to something quickly is also going to have kind of scatter accessibility effects for like cognitive accessibility, mobility accessibility, things like that. And finally, as I said before, avoid death by 1,000 cuts. If you're building something weird, building something complex, like focus on the basics, really nail down the page structure outside of the UI you're making. So if somebody gets lost, they can find their way back to it quickly. I've seen apps where you have something like a complex flowchart or like editable like data visualization that are nested within an app that is already complex. And the combination of those gets people really, really frustrated because they will get lost in the data visualization in the flowchart. And if they also get lost in the rest of the page, that just like will make people give up or be just, cry at their computer, kind of literally. So yes, focus on basics, make everything else that isn't complex as simple as you possibly can. And now I've talked through how to do all of this really hard work of defining new things. The last thing to do is change the map. Especially if you're to see frequently, but that you aren't finding good guidance for, that's a great kind of heads up that the map itself might need to change. For example, something that I'm working on right now is this idea of like tabs that can close and other kind of that have secondary actions on them. I have an example of the Visual Studio Code file tabs interface, and each tab has a close button. And it's not obvious whether that button should be within the tab, semantically should be outside of it. How do you access it with a keyboard? And things like this exist all over the place. I had some images on my last slide. There are, for example, in a meeting chat or in a meeting, you have a list of participants. Each participant might have a mute button, a more actions button. Those are secondary actions that also exist on the participant itself. Things like a list of documents might have edit, delete buttons on them. Things like that in ARIA don't have a way to actually define them because they aren't, by the spec, they are not allowed within something like a tab or a tree item. And also they are not allowed as a sibling either. So there is no map for this. There is no defined way to use the keyboard to access them. So brief plug for something I'm working on now is changing the spec to actually allow for this. So change the map, make it easier for people who come after. You don't have to literally work on specs to improve the map. Things like blog posts and articles detailing what you did will be so helpful for anyone who's building something similar later. And as I keep mentioning context, as you change the map, just be sure to write down why you did what you did. What was the context? What were you thinking about when you made these decisions? Because that will help the people who come later evaluate their context versus your context. And I know I've gone a little over. Thank you for letting me continue a bit past. My slides are online at smhigley.github.io/slides. And my Twitter is Coding Chaos, and I will try to do Q&A on Twitter because I know we missed it.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Really appreciate you motoring through this thing. You did a fantastic job. Thanks everybody for joining us.